Alright guys, this is the study guide video for the indigenous people and settlements in Tennessee, the American Indian tribes, and the Cumberland Gap and Wilderness Road. So as you can see in our study guide, we're answering the question, how did the name Tennessee originate? Well, it originated from the American Indian word Tanotsi. It refers to where the rivers come together. It was spelled many different ways, as you can see right there, T-A-N-S-E, T-O-N-I-C-E, T-E-N-A-S-I, and T-U-N-A-S-E-E. The original spelling of Tennessee was first recorded in the 1750s from the South Carolina governor. And so you've got to think that we've talked in class about how different students have different spellings, and if you don't know how to spell a word, you write it down the best you can. With Indians not having a written language like we do, that kind of let it go back and forth. All right, so there were four major indigenous settlements. And remember, indigenous just means native, or we talked in class how it means OG. It's the original. The first is the Paleo. The Paleo means ancient. So they were nomads, which means they moved around and followed food, like mammoths and mastodons, saber-toothed tiger. They're the ones that came over on the land bridge when it froze over between Russia and Alaska. The most famous site in Tennessee is the Coates Hines site. Here they found mastodon bones along with stone tools. So this proved to us that Paleo Indians actually lived in Tennessee. The next group is the Archaic. They were hunter-gatherers. They hunted animals, they gathered food, they lived in rock shelters. Now here's the important thing about them. They were the first group to stay in one place. They created stone spears and earliest pottery. They even started farming just a little bit. The next group is the Woodland. This is getting really close to home. They lived near four lakes and rivers. They were hunter-gatherers. They began farming. They had maize as a kind of Indian corn. They used bow and arrows. They're the first group, like the traditional bow and arrows. They created pottery with designs. Pins and mounds. I think most fourth graders last year went to pins and mounds. This was created by the Woodland Indians. It was used for burial and ceremonies. There's a place called the Old Stone Fort, which we thought was a fort when we first found it, and then we found out pretty quickly that they just used it for ceremonies. Both of these, Pinson Mounds and the Old Stone Fort, this is important, showed complex societies lived in Tennessee. The final group is the Mississippians. They lived in the Mississippi River Valley. That's why they're called the Mississippians. They were mound builders like the Woodland. They made weapons, pottery, and jewelry. They were hunter-gatherers and farmers. The most famous site for the Mississippians is the Chucalissa Indian Village around Memphis. It is the best preserved prehistoric Indian settlement. All right, the next, we're looking at the American Indian tribe. So we have the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Shawnee. All right, the Cherokee are the largest group. They lived in the southeast U.S. The men were hunters and traders. The women planted and gathered, and in Cherokee society, men and women were equal. The leaders were the principal chief, that was the male. The beloved woman was the female leader. She sometimes, if she did something great, especially if she picked up after her husband in battle, we'll talk about Nancy Ward and how she was a beloved woman later. They had a summer home and a winter home. The summer homes were big and they allowed a breeze to blow through to keep them cool. The winter homes were smaller and they had fires inside. The next group is the Chickasaw. They lived along the rivers in Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and Kentucky. They had a chief and a village council to help make their decisions. They were very warlike. They raised sons to become brave fighters who couldn't complain or show pain. The Creeks, they lived in the southeast. Their biggest settlement was around Chattanooga, Tennessee. They also lived in Alabama and Georgia. They were hunters and they farmed. They built villages around a plaza, which is a big open area where they had games and ceremonies. Their biggest enemy was the Cherokee. The Chickasaw and the Cherokee would actually team up with the Creeks, or against the Creeks. The final American Indian tribe is the Nomads. They lived in wigwams. Their primary village was in Nashville, and they're actually one of the first groups to trade with Europeans. All right, and finally, we're looking at how we're finally going to have contact with white settlers and Native Americans. So the question is, how did the Cumberland Gap influence migration in the Tennessee region? Well, the proclamation of 1763 set aside land west of the Appalachian Mountains. So if we're looking at a map on the left side of these mountains for the American Indians. We talked in class today about how that they had conflict between the American Indians and the settlers, and it was because the Indians felt like the settlers were coming in and taking their land. To stop this and stop the battles and the bloodshed that was coming over this conflict, the King of England said, okay, nobody else, no other settlers can go to the left of this or to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. So it prohibited the colonists from settling there. People didn't like this. They did not like the fact that a king thousands and thousands of miles away was telling them how to live. Now, the Cumberland Gap was a shortcut through the Appalachian Mountains where Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky meet, and is actually going to influence people to not listen to the proclamation of 1763. The shortcut was like an invitation to the settler. They saw this big dip in the mountains where they could go and walk straight through and not have to go over the mountains, and it was just too appealing, too inviting. They were influenced to go through there. It influenced the people to travel to the Tennessee region and make it their home. Now, next week we'll talk about the Watauga settlement, which is where people went through the Cumberland Gap and created the first permanent settlement in Tennessee. The last question is, how did the Wilderness Road influence migration into the Tennessee region following the proclamation of 1763? Well, Daniel Boone was set up by the Transylvania Company, and he carved a road through the Cumberland Gap. He cut down trees. He made a road in place where settlers could walk easier rather than have to go through the forest. So he cut a trail through the wilderness, or a road through the wilderness. That's why it's called the Wilderness Road. Settlers sent goods back east, and the road became important for trade. Now, instead of having to go around the mountains or through the river or over the mountains, you can now send goods right back. So they would go and kill bears and rabbits and deer, and they would skin them, and they would send their skins back, and they would send logs back. So it was a good trade route for the West. Now, if you study everything that's got a star and everything that's underlined, it should be fairly easy, or our quiz should be fairly easy for you. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know.